Today I'm sharing with you the 6 biggest mistakes to avoid when you're starting out in photography. If you want to take better photos, watch this video to learn what to avoid. Hey there, welcome to the channel. If you're new here, my name's Chris. I'm teaching you photography and how to start a creative business. I want to say a special hi to all my new subscribers. Welcome to the channel. Today I'm sharing with you the top 6 mistakes to avoid as a beginner photographer. These are mistakes I made when I was starting out, and I'm sharing them with you today so that you can avoid them. Let's get into it. Mistake number 1, not paying attention to the light conditions that you're shooting in. Do you look at your photos and wonder why they don't look like those of the professionals? There's a really good chance you don't understand lighting. I would argue that lighting is the most important element of photography. We need to understand how the position of a light source will affect your images. Let's use the sun as an example. Everyone knows that the sun changes positions throughout the day. You may have heard photographers talk about shooting at golden hour. This is the hour after sunrise and the hour before sunset. During this time, the sun is the lowest in the sky, and that leads to 2 important things. First, there's going to be a lot of shadows around you. Since the sun is lower in the sky, it's coming in at a lower angle, and this is causing shadows to happen all around you. These shadows add more depth to your images. Everything looks a lot better. There's also going to be more texture in your surroundings. Because the sun is lower in the sky, things like grass, snow, sand, even concrete is going to have more detail. There are minuscule shadows that are happening in the individual blades of grass that cause the appearance of this texture. The second reason why shooting at this time is good is because the sun will become a softer light source. When the sun is up in the sky at noon, it's producing harsh light. You may notice that the sun appears bigger towards sunset. Because it's a bigger light source, that will lead to softer shadows. Softer shadows usually lead to better photos. I'm not telling you to only shoot around golden hour, but using golden hour to your advantage will help with your photos. Mistake number 2, only taking 1 or 2 photos of a scene or subject. As photographers, when we see something interesting, we want to take a photo of it. We'll grab our cameras and snap a few pics. What sets apart a pro from an amateur is how they approach the scene. An amateur photographer will take out their camera, point at the subject, and only take a couple photos. A pro will take a minute or 2 and walk around the area and try and find the best angle and framing to capture that subject. Maybe photographing down low from ground level will lead to a more interesting image. Maybe there's something interesting in the foreground that you can frame your subject through. Taking a bit of time to explore the options you have in photographing your scene will lead to better photos in the end. Photography is not just this mindless act of pressing a shutter button. It's about visualizing a scene and putting the pieces together to get the best photo possible of that scene. Mistake number 3, not using your histogram. Do you know what a histogram is? It's a graph that shows the distribution of light in your image. The left side of your histogram shows all your shadows. These are the darkest parts of your image. The right side shows all the highlights. These are the brightest parts of your image. The middle, that's your midtones, and that's everything in between the shadows and highlights. Where the histogram really comes in handy is if you're shooting in really bright or really dark conditions. If you don't expose your photo properly in these conditions, you can actually lose detail in your photos that you can't get back. This is called clipping. If you're shooting a really bright scene and a lot of it looks really bright white, chances are you won't be able to get that information back. That's where the histogram comes in. This handy graph tells you when you're losing those bright parts of the image. If parts of the histogram are all the way to the right, that means that the data is lost. If this is happening, just lower your exposure until your histogram is more balanced towards the middle. That way, you won't lose that information. The same exact principle applies to shooting really dark scenes. Mirrorless cameras have the ability to display your histogram in real time, so play around with that setting on your camera. Mistake number 4, not shooting RAW. I know I'm guilty of this. When I started out, I didn't think I would take photography too seriously, so I only shot in JPEG. Looking back now, I can't really go back and edit those photos I took early on. Don't make the same mistake. I know shooting in RAW can sound intimidating, but it's really not. Shooting RAW means you'll have to edit your photos, but that allows you for so much more customization and freedom. The RAW file format doesn't do any processing to the image other than the bare essentials. It's going to be up to you to add the contrast, saturation, tone curve, all that good stuff. It gives you a lot of freedom with how you want to manipulate your photos. JPEG doesn't allow much flexibility when editing. What your camera shoots is what you get. Switch over to RAW as soon as you can. It takes a little bit more time, but learning how to use this versatile file format in your workflow will make you a better photographer. Speaking of editing, this next one addresses just that. Can you guess what it is? Mistake number 5, using too much saturation in your photos. A lot of beginners like to crank the saturation way up on their photos. I've definitely done this, and looking back, I don't know what I was thinking. Rarely will cranking up the saturation make a photo look better. Personally, I don't even touch the saturation slider. Sometimes I use vibrance, which is a more subtle version of saturation. Instead of messing around with the saturation, play with the basic settings in Lightroom. Change the highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. Play around with these until you get a photo that you start liking. Then, if you want to change some colors, I'd recommend going to the Hue, Saturation, Luminance panel, or HSL, and changing the saturation of individual colors here. I sometimes like to take certain colors out of my images to lead to a certain look. This is how a lot of photographers achieve their signature look. Play around with these sliders and see what you can come up with. Mistake number 6, setting ISO too high. Okay, so you know about the exposure triangle and how increasing ISO will brighten up the photo. You think that you found the magic trick to always getting a perfectly exposed photo because you can just crank up the ISO, right? Not so fast. The higher you set the ISO, the more noise or grain you introduce to the image. This is fine up to a certain point, but if you crank it up too high, you'll ruin your photo with this grain. So what is too high? That kind of depends on your camera. Higher end cameras can easily shoot up to 1600 or 3200 with minimal noise. Budget cameras are maybe good up to 800 or maybe 1600. The more often you can shoot on a low ISO like 100 or 200, the better. But like with anything, there are some exceptions. If you're photographing at night and see this awesome scene, you look through your camera but it's super dark. You've messed with the aperture, shutter speed, and it's still dark, go ahead and crank up that ISO. Capturing an awesome subject is going to make the grain in the photo not really matter. If your options are you can capture this photo or not capture it, of course you want to capture it. Sometimes you just have to be smart on how you break these rules. If you're shooting during the day, there's no reason for cranking up the ISO, but sometimes at night it's warranted. Well, there you have it. Those were my top 6 mistakes to avoid in photography. Break these rules at your own risk. Next time you go out and take photos, keep these in mind. The best way to learn is to practice. Practice with these tips and you'll be a better photographer. Good luck. I appreciate you watching and I think it's awesome that you want to learn more about photography. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, it really helps the channel out. I'm excited to make more of these and I'll see you guys in the next one.